Part 38. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 372. Chapter 370, The Assassination of the Prince. King Xian touched the short beard on his chin and murmured, "She said she wouldn't go to the wedding banquet yesterday. Why did she suddenly change her mind? When she went out today, she specially changed her clothes." Princess Xian thought for a while and said, "She also inexplicably asked me to donate 1,000 taels of incense money for her to Puju temple. She clearly didn't believe this before." King Xian suddenly thought of something, his expression changed, and he asked, "The palace didn't let anyone in today, right?" Princess Xian thought for a while, shook her head and said, "There are no guests today." King Xian looked regretful on his face and said, "It's all my fault. She shouldn't have been allowed to go to Chen country in the first place." Princess Xian looked confused and asked, "What does this have to do with her going to Chen kingdom?" King Xian did not answer, and frowned slightly. After thinking for a while, he said, "Starting from tomorrow, the defense around the palace will be doubled." Speaking of defense, Princess Xian looked at him, frowned and asked, "What happened to the assassin that Lan Lan just mentioned?" King Xian was speechless for a moment. Seeing her serious expression, he sighed and had to tell her what happened today. "You don't know how dangerous this capital is." Princess Xian looked at him and said solemnly, "You are not allowed to go out alone in the future." King Xian nodded and said, "I understand." Princess Xian added, "If you have the opportunity, you must thank that young man. Otherwise, Lanlan and I will not be able to see you today." King Xian said, "I have already sent someone to check." Princess Xian was silent for a moment, then grabbed his hand and said, "Isn't it better to be an idle prince? Why do you want to be a regent? The prince hates you so much. If we wait for him to take the throne, how can we have a good life?" "Don't worry." King Xian patted her hand and said, "No matter what, I will not let you and Lanlan be wronged." After a long time, he walked out of the room. A figure who had been waiting outside the door for a long time followed him and whispered, "Your Majesty, the envoy of the Wanyan department, and the prince seem to have reached some kind of deal. The prince has already taken action." King Xian put his hands behind his back, looked into the distance, and said, "Let's see how he plans to act." The figure stood behind King Xian. He looked up and saw the figure in front of him. The figure was not very tall, but in his eyes, he seemed to be a giant as tall as a mountain. In fact, the person in front of him is indeed a giant. With just one word from him, he can immediately become the king of Chu country. Whether in the court or among the people, there are countless people waiting for his words, but so far they have not waited. Splendid palace. Tang Ning and Li Tianlan parted ways, and the curfew was approaching. When they returned to Jingxia Palace, the last street cleaning drum had been beaten. "Master Tang." The guard at the door bowed and saluted. After nodding, he walked into his room and saw a figure wandering in the room. He asked in surprise, "Princess, why haven't you rested yet?" "You're back." Seeing him coming in, Zhao Man came over happily, handed him a few pastries on the table, and said, "Try this, it's a pastry from Chu State, it's delicious. You are not here in the afternoon, I left half for you." She directly stretched out her hand to feed him a piece. Tang Ning opened his mouth in confusion. Zhao Man put the pastry into his mouth and asked, "How is it? Is it delicious?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "It's delicious. I knew you would also like it." She smiled, her eyes curled up, and she said happily, "I'll ask them to make more tomorrow and send you a copy." It's really hard to guess a girl's thoughts. After not seeing each other for a year, Her Highness the Princess just took him to eat a bowl of noodles. The princess waited so late in his room just to let him taste the pastries of Chu State. After sending Zhao Man back to bed, Tang Ning closed the door, poured a cup of tea, and sat at the table when she returned to her room. Although he seemed to have a lot of leisure these past 2 days, he was actually not that idle. Before the situation was clear, there was no definite plan for how to solve Zhao Man's matter or Li Tianlan's matter, and the situation in Chu state was far more complicated than he had imagined before. The errand assigned to him by Emperor Chen was not as simple as sending a wedding proposal. He took an envelope from his arms and opened it. There was nothing written on the envelope. There was a piece of paper inside the envelope with only 2 words on it. Believe in the king. This was given to him by Fang Zhe before leaving. 2 very simple words, but very important. The chaos in Chu state actually originated from the Crown Prince and King Xian. Although the prince is the Crown Prince, King Xian is not another idle prince. He is the regent. He is famous in the court and convinced by all officials. There are endless opinions among the people and the court that King Xian should replace the prince. If anyone were the prince, under such pressure, he would probably not be able to sleep well, and he wished he could be the king without trust. Even if King Xian has no intention of seizing the throne, there are some things he can't control. If the prince ascends the throne, how can he tolerate a prince sitting on his head? King Xian's family will not end well. Before these things were clear, the envoys from the state of Chen and the envoys from the grassland came to the state of Chu again, adding chaos to the chaos. Under such circumstances, smart people will not act rashly, but will stop with silence and not be adaptable and wait for the other party to reveal their flaws first. If Tang Ning's guess is correct, Xiao Maniu and her group should be envoys from the grassland. They are a large tribe, and they want to marry a princess with 1,000 horses as a betrothal gift. Even if no one pays attention to them, they have successfully stirred up the waters of Chu. In a post house somewhere, a man shouted loudly, "Why do the people of Chen live in big gardens, but we can only live in small post houses? My great grassland will be flattened sooner or later." "Shut up!" The middle-aged woman glanced at him, and he immediately shut up. Wang Yanyan walked up to the woman and asked, "Master, why should we help the Prince of Chu? People outside say he is a big idiot." The middle-aged woman looked at her and said, "It is much better for an idiot to be the emperor than for Prince Xian to be the emperor. Although he is a waste, he is also a useful waste. Once Prince Xian becomes the emperor, the grassland will be in danger." Wang Yanyan thought about it and stuck out her tongue. She thought that the Han people were really cunning. That guy was like this, and so was Master. She could never think of what they thought of. She thought about it and asked, "Then what should we do now?" The middle-aged woman stood up and said, "Just wait and see." Last night, she made an appointment with Li Tianlan for today. After lunch, Tang Ning set out from Jingxiu Palace. There is still a long distance from Jingxiu Palace to Prince Xian's mansion. "Have you heard that the prince was assassinated this morning?" "What, is it true?" "I saw it with my own eyes, how could it be false?" "It was on the street, even archers were used, and several of the prince's guards were killed or injured. If they hadn't risked their lives to save him, I'm afraid the prince would have suffered more than just a few minor injuries. Who is so bold that he dared to assassinate the prince on the streets of Kyoto?" Hearing the voices of 2 people discussing at a roadside stall, Tang Ning paused and looked over. At the tea stall, one person said mysteriously, "Who else could it be? Think about it, who would benefit the most if the prince died?" The other person thought about it and murmured, "Could it be, what a pity, if the prince was assassinated, wouldn't the prince be able to become the emperor?" "Keep your voice down, keep your voice down, if someone hears you, you won't have enough heads to chop off." Tang Ning was also stunned. The prince was assassinated this morning and was injured. Is the security in the capital of Chu really that bad? It's a pity that he was only slightly injured, otherwise he could go back to Jingxiu Palace, pack up his things, and take Zhao Yingying back home. But there is no need to be discouraged. This time he was slightly injured, but it might not be the case next time. Zhao Yingying's plan to seize the city may not be impossible to win without bloodshed. He walked to the vicinity of Prince Xian's mansion, circled to the place where he jumped over the wall yesterday, and was about to climb over when he was startled. Under the wall, a row of guards were standing there, scanning the surroundings with a covetous look. In this case, it was absolutely impossible for him to climb over without being noticed. Tang Ning just walked closer, and several eyes were cast on him. A guard stepped forward and said in a deep voice, "What are you doing?" "Just passing by," Tang Ning replied, and walked forward. Halfway through the walk, he stopped again, looked in the direction of the wall, and whispered, "Cuckoo, cuckoo." If she was familiar with the two books Romance of the West Chamber and Peony Pavilion, she would know the meaning of this code. The facts did not disappoint him. As soon as he finished speaking, a figure flew out from the wall. Watching the princess and the young man gradually go away, a guard finally came to his senses and hurriedly said, "Quick, go back and tell the prince that the princess ran away with a man." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 373. Snapped. King Xian slapped his hand on the table and said angrily, "I tried to take all precautions, but I still failed to take precautions." "What's wrong?" Princess Xian looked at him, suspicion flashed in her eyes, and asked, "Are you hiding something from me?" "It's okay." Bookmark this side. King Xian shook his head and said, "Something happened in the court, and I have to deal with it now." He strode out of the door, and someone came forward and said, "Your Majesty, there is something fishy about the prince's assassination. Do you want someone to investigate?" Learning the bitter meat trick can be regarded as a skill. King Xian waved his hand and said, "Don't worry about him, let him do it on his own." He looked at the man and said, "Take people to find the princess and bring back the people who are with her." The man cupped his hands and said, "Yes." Prince's mansion. The Prince of Chu State had gauze wrapped around his head and was lying on the bed. A maid beside him peeled the chilled grapes and put them into his mouth. A young man walked in from the door, walked to the bed, waved to the two maids, and they immediately stood up, saluted, and slowly withdrew. The young man looked at the prince and said respectfully, "Your Highness, the news has been released. The news of your assassination has been known to everyone." The prince spit out the grape seeds and asked, "What did they say?" The young man said, "Your Highness's trick is really clever. There are only the crown prince and the regent in the capital. Even if the regent doesn't want to bear the blame, he still has to bear it." The prince sneered and said, "Isn't he famous? I want to see how he explains it." The young man smiled and said, "If King Xian did not explain, the people would think that he acquiesced in the matter. If he forced an explanation, people would also think that he was trying to cover up. They would never have thought that His Highness would assassinate him." The prince waved his hand and said, "Okay, keep an eye on what's going on outside at all times. If there is any news, report it to me immediately." Not long after the envoys from Chenkuahe grassland arrived in Kyoto, they were completely overshadowed by an incident before it aroused enough heated discussion. The prince's car was assassinated on the street, killing several guards, and even the prince himself was slightly injured. This can be said to be the most serious case that has occurred in the capital in recent years. The current emperor is seriously ill, and the prince, as the crown prince, is also the only heir to the throne. If something goes wrong, the government will be in chaos. Therefore, as soon as the case comes out, it attracts enough attention. Jingzhou Mansion Yamen and the Ministry of Punishment started investigating as soon as possible. Jingzhou Mansion Office. A few corpses were placed in the hall, all of which were the guards of the prince's mansion who had been killed this time. The policemen in the Yamen had already left in full force. The governor of Jingzhou walked around the hall with a suspicious look on his face. He looked at the corpses and murmured, "Is the prince planning to start an uprising?" A man hurriedly walked in, looked at the corpses on the ground, and asked, What on earth is going on? Jing Zheyin looked at the Minister of Punishment and said, I was just about to ask you, is it the prince's side? No one told me, and this doesn't seem to be the prince's method. The Minister of Punishment shook his head and said, you and I both know that if the prince had wanted to, he would have been able to dominate the world long ago. Why wait until today? Jing Zheyin shook his head and said, today is different from the past. There is a close friend of this officer in the Imperial Hospital. He only revealed a piece of news to me 2 days ago. The Minister of Punishment's eyes moved and he asked, what's the news? Jing Zheyin took a step forward and said in a low voice, Your Majesty's body may not be able to survive this year. The expression on the face of the Minister of Punishment suddenly changed. Seriously? Jing Zheyin shook his head and said, if Your Majesty hadn't taken a few doses of life-extending medicine, I'm afraid he wouldn't have been able to survive now. The medicine is 3/3 poisonous. After the effects of those few doses of medicine have worn off, it will be hard to save him. The Minister of Justice looked out the door. The sky was clear and cloudless, but in his eyes, what he saw seemed to be gathering dark clouds, getting lower and lingering for a long time. He let out a long sigh and said, the rain is coming, and the sky is about to collapse. How are you and I going to deal with it? Jing Zheyin clenched his fists and said, there is a strong enemy watching on the grassland. Although Chen Guo and we are in alliance in name, they are actually on guard against each other. It took great difficulty for Chu State to reach this point. Do all the courtiers and people in the world have to watch Chu today? The country was destroyed. The Minister of Justice looked at him and asked, what do you mean? If the prince is not deposed, then Chu will be deposed. If the world falls into the hands of the prince, will the people still have a good life? The prince has done so many evil things over the years. God has no eyes to see. Why didn't he let the assassin kill him? If the prince dies, King Xian will definitely not stand idly by and let Chu State do nothing. It is 10 times better for the prince to be the emperor than to be the prince. As Tang Ning and Li Tianlan walked on the street, they heard countless similar remarks. The prince of Chu State has long been called a beating among the people. This kind of statement is treasonous anywhere, but it is so popular in the streets and markets of Chu State. Li Tianlan seemed to be used to this. He turned his head, looked at him and asked, so you came to Chu State to prevent the marriage? Tang Ning nodded. Li Tianlan looked into his eyes and asked, then are you stopping Princess Pingyang from marrying the prince, or are you stopping me from marrying to Chen Guo? Both Tang Ning thought for a while and said, both the Crown Prince and Prince Duankong are not good people. If you marry them, your life will be ruined. Li Tianlan looked away and asked, how can you stop it on your own? In fact, before arriving in Chu, Tang Ning did think it was difficult to stop the marriage, but only 2 days after arriving in Chu, he realized that this matter seemed easier than he thought. He did not answer this question, but looked at Li Tianlan and asked, if the prince really becomes the emperor, what will you do? Li Tianlan paused and did not speak. The prince regarded Prince Xian as a thorn in his side, and he was afraid that the first thing he would do after ascending the throne would be to get rid of them. Tang Ning looked at her and said, if you can't stay in Chu, you can come to Chen. No matter how long the prince's hand is, it can't reach Chen. I can protect you. Tang Ning is very experienced in hiding people. Hiding a princess is hiding, and hiding more princesses is also hiding. There is not much difference. And this is only the worst case. If Prince Xian thinks it through, he will call for the prince to be abolished, the princess will not have to marry, and the princess will not have to marry. This trip abroad at public expense can also come to a perfect end. Li Tianlan glanced at him and said, with your mediocre skills, protect yourself first. Tang Ning was about to speak when a team of guards came hurriedly from the back and walked in front of Li Tianlan. The leader bowed and said, Princess, the prince asked you to go back. There is something important to discuss. Tang Ning looked at her and said, You go back first. We will see each other another day. The leader looked at Tang Ning again and said, the prince said that this young master should go with him. Leixin had visited the prince's mansion several times, but it was not until today that he could enter through the main gate. Tang Ning waited in the living room for a long time and drank 2 cups of tea before a servant came in and said, young master, the prince is waiting for you in the study. Tang Ning followed him to the door of the study. The servant stopped and bowed, saying, the prince is inside. Tang Ning knocked on the door and walked in. In front of the desk, a figure was writing with his back to him. Tang Ning walked up to him, bowed, and said, Tang Ning greets His Royal Highness Prince Xian. Prince Xian looked back at him, a trace of surprise appeared on his face, and blurted out, it's you are Tang Ning. So it's you are Prince Xian. Tang Ning looked at the middle-aged man he met while fishing with Zhao Man yesterday, and spoke in surprise. Prince Xian looked at him, frowned, and asked, who was the girl with you yesterday? For some reason, being looked at by Prince Xian with such suspicion and scrutiny, Tang Ning's mind inexplicably appeared the shadow of another person. The way Mr. Tang looked at him on weekdays was exactly the same as Prince Xian's at this moment. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 374. Prince Xian looked at him unfriendly, as if he was on guard against thieves. Yesterday, Zhao Man only wore light makeup. Prince Xian would meet her sooner or later. At this time, Tang Ning had nothing to hide, so he said, she is Princess Ping Yang. Princess Ping Yang. Prince Xian looked at him and said, you are so bold. Tang Ning asked back, why do you say that, Your Majesty? Prince Xian said, Princess Ping Yang is of such status, and you actually took her to wander around the streets. If something goes wrong, can you bear the responsibility? Your Majesty is the regent, but you didn't bring any guards with you to wander around the streets. Seeing that Prince Xian was asking for punishment, Tang Ning looked at him and said, those assassins yesterday were coming for the prince, right? Prince Xian looked at him and asked, are you reminding me that you saved me? Tang Ning shook his head and said, Your Highness has misunderstood. Even if others don't know how to be grateful, I won't repay the favor. After chatting for a few words, they started to confront each other. Tang Ning understood that the previous few times he was rejected must have been intentional by Prince Xian. For some reason, His Highness Prince Xian, who had no intersection with him before, was not friendly to him. Sharp-tongued, Prince Xian glanced at him, sat on the chair, and asked, You came to Prince Xian's mansion to ask for marriage. Tang Ning looked at him and asked, Didn't you ask me to come? Prince Xian knocked the teacup heavily on the table, I was talking about 2 days ago. Tang Ning shook his head and said, I came to find the princess. Looking for Lanlan, Prince Xian glanced at him, Are you familiar with Lanlan? Tang Ning thought for a while and said, Lanlan and I, are quite familiar. Prince Xian stood up suddenly and said angrily, You can call Lanlan. Li Tianlan walked in from the door and asked, What's the matter? Nothing. Tang Ning looked at her, shook his head, and looked at Prince Xian again, saying, If the prince has nothing to do, I will go back first. Prince Xian stood up and said, I am not a person who knows how to repay a favor. You saved me. I will thank you if I have the chance in the future. Since you are here today, why not have a simple meal before leaving? Eating itself is a very pleasant thing, but it also depends on who you eat with. Tang Ning also thought that eating a simple bowl of plain noodles with the princess was a delicacy, but with Prince Xian, who obviously disliked him, even if he ate delicacies from land and sea, he still had to worry whether Prince Xian had poisoned the food. Tang Ning bowed and said, Thank you, Your Highness, but I still have some things to do. Li Tianlan looked up at Tang Ning with a meaningful look. Prince Xian waved his hand, since your highness has invited me so kindly, it doesn't matter if those things are postponed for a while. Tang Ning bowed and said, sorry for bothering you. In the garden of Prince Xian's mansion, Tang Ning looked at Li Tianlan and said, your father doesn't seem to like me very much. Li Tianlan did not continue the topic and asked, what does father mean by not repaying a favor? Tang Ning recounted what happened yesterday. Are you the one from yesterday? Li Tianlan looked at him, puzzled, but my father said yesterday that you are very interesting and he admires you very much. The fact shows that the rumors about Prince Xian are wrong. He is just a big pig with changeable ideas. Tang Ning waved his hand and said, there is no such thing as not repaying a favor. You saved me once, and I saved Prince Xian once. It's even. Li Tianlan shook his head and said, I am me, and my father is my father. My father feels that he owes you, and you don't owe me anything. Tang Ning looked at her and said, how can I, Tang Ning, be ungrateful? If you need me in the future, just ask me. I will go through fire and water without hesitation. Not to mention that she saved him, just talking about the friendship between the two of them, even if he was asked to go through fire and water to sacrifice himself, Tang Ning would not frown. That's what you said. Li Tianlan looked at him and said, go to the lawn in front. We haven't seen each other for a year. Let's see if your martial arts have improved. Although Tang Ning has been busy all year, he has never stopped practicing martial arts. He can't catch up with her in a short time, but compared with ordinary people, he has made rapid progress. He sparred with Tang Yaoyao, Su Mei, and Li Tianlan. Although the results were the same, the gains were different. Tang Yaojing used him as a human sandbag, Su Mei only wanted to trick him into bed, and only the princess would teach him seriously without any reservation. In just half an hour, Tang Ning benefited a lot and gained some more insights in martial arts. A maid came in from outside and said, Princess, the prince asked you to go over for dinner. Tang Ning and her walked into a hall. The table in the middle was already filled with various dishes. Prince Xian and a beautiful woman in palace dress had already taken their seats. Li Tianlan looked at the woman in palace dress and said, this is my mother. Tang Ning bowed and said, meet the princess. Sit down. Princess Xian nodded with a smile and said, I heard from the prince that you saved him yesterday. Tang Ning sat down opposite Prince Xian and said, it was a coincidence. If it weren't for you yesterday, the prince would be in danger. Princess Xian looked at Tang Ning and said, whatever reward you want, the prince and I will satisfy you. Tang Ning looked at Li Tianlan, shook her head and said, I don't want any reward, I just saw injustice, the princess is polite. No matter what, the palace owes you a favor. Princess Xian said, and then asked, have you known Lanlan for a long time? Tang Ning nodded and said, 2 years ago, when the princess was on a diplomatic mission to Chen State, we knew each other. Prince Xian coughed lightly and said, let's eat, it will get cold if we don't eat now. Princess Xian nodded and said, let's talk after we finish eating. I don't know if our Chu dishes are to your taste. In fact, in comparison, Chu dishes are more to his taste, and even have a kind of familiar feeling. Tang Ning picked up a piece of bamboo shoots, and when he was about to put it in his mouth, his hand stopped and sniffed slightly. The bamboo shoots tasted bitter, but before he put it in his mouth, Tang Ning smelled a faint sweet fragrance. He put down his chopsticks and said quickly, wait. Prince Xian and Princess Xian had already picked up their chopsticks. Hearing this, they looked at Tang Ning with doubts on their faces. Tang Ning stood up and said, this dish is poisonous. He looked at Prince Xian. He invited him to dinner for no reason. Was Prince Xian really planning to poison the dish to get rid of him? Pa! The chopsticks in Princess Xian's hand fell to the ground and she said hurriedly, how is that possible? We are using silver chopsticks. Tang Ning looked at her and explained, silver needles and silver chopsticks can only test for arsenic poison. This poison is called arsenic, which is a chronic poison. After poisoning, it will not take effect immediately. But if it is consumed for a long time, it will be too late even if it is discovered after several months. Prince Xian could not invite him to dinner every day. This should not be poisoned by him. Catch all the people in charge of the palace's meals. Prince Xian put down his chopsticks, looked behind him, and said, call the imperial physician. Tang Ning looked at Li Tianlan and said, come with me. Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, what for? Check your body. Seeing Prince Xian's eyes looking over, Tang Ning added, check if you're poisoned. It's very simple to check if there's perennial balsam poisoning. Just drop a few drops of blood into clean water and add the antidote. If black precipitate appears, it means that there's perennial balsam poison in the blood. Li Tianlan pricked his finger with a needle, dripped the blood into the bowl, and subconsciously put his finger into his mouth. This action is a little girlish. Zhao Man doesn't do anything wrong, but for a princess with a noble temperament, doing this action will add a different style that is rarely seen on weekdays. Cough, Prince Xian coughed heavily. Tang Ning retracted her gaze, dipped a little antidote powder with chopsticks, and mixed it with water. After a while, she looked at the water whose color had not changed, breathed a sigh of relief, and said, she is not poisoned. Lanlan rarely eats in the mansion on weekdays. Princess Xian looked at Tang Ning and said, help Grandpa Wang take another look. Tang Ning then checked Prince Xian and Princess Xian again. There was a little sediment at the bottom of the bowl. Judging from the amount of sediment, they had been poisoned for at least half a month. At this time, the imperial physician came late, smelled the lettuce, tasted it himself, and then looked at Prince Xian with panic and said, Your Highness, it is definitely the lily of the valley. Prince Xian asked in a deep voice, is there an antidote? I am incompetent. The imperial physician knelt on the ground and said in a trembling voice, the imperial hospital only has records of this poison, but no antidote. Princess Xian's body swayed, and Li Tianlan hurriedly supported her. He looked at Tang Ning and asked hurriedly, is there an antidote? Tang Ning waved her hand, it's a small matter. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 375. Zhirixiang is indeed an uncommon poison. To be more precise, the antidote to this poison has been lost. The art of poisoning originated from the now extinct Liang state. During the most prosperous period of Liang state accounted for more than half of the world's poisons. With the demise of Liang state, many poisons were rarely seen in the world. Compared with those strange poisons that kill people instantly, Zhirixiang is not very famous. However, because the antidote to Zhirixiang has been lost, it can poison people silently, and it has become one of the most widely spread poisons. In order to be on the safe side, Tang Ning always has the antidote on him. He handed the small porcelain bottle to Li Tianlan and said, this contains the antidote for Lily of the Valley. You only need to take a small amount each time, with warm water, 3 times a day, and the poison will be eliminated in 3 days. He looked at the imperial physician and said, although a small amount of Lily of the Valley is not fatal, it is also harmful to the body. It is better for the imperial physician to take the antidote once. The imperial physician looked at him and said in disbelief, is there really an antidote for Lily of the Valley? Can you let me take a look? Li Tianlan handed him the porcelain bottle. The imperial physician dipped a little with chopsticks, put it under his nose and smelled it, then put it in his mouth, and was amazed. He said, it is said that the antidote for Lily of the Valley has long been lost. I didn't expect that this recipe still exists in the world. I wonder if this young master can. Tang Ning knew what the imperial physician meant. He prepared these antidotes himself, so he naturally knew the recipe. Without much hesitation, he nodded and said, I will write down the recipe and give it to you later. Lily of the Valley is one of the most commonly used poisons today. Because the antidote formula has been lost, the clinical manifestations after poisoning are not very obvious. By the time it is discovered, it is too late. Therefore, it is considered to be a highly toxic poison with no cure. When he was in the state of Chen, he gave the prescription to Ling Yuheng and passed it on to the imperial physician of the state of Chu. Who knows, it can save many lives in the future. At this time, a young general strode in from outside the door, knelt on one knee, and said, "Your Highness, after we arrested all the people in charge of the meals, Chef Zhao committed suicide by taking poison." Prince Xian looked calm and asked, "Have you found out her background?" This Chef Zhao was newly recruited by the palace half a month ago. She has a clean background. I have sent people to check her family. The general bowed his head and said, "It was my fault that such a bad guy got in. Please punish me, Your Highness." Prince Xian waved his hand and said, "You can go down." Although only that plate of lettuce was poisoned with fennel, such a thing happened, and a good meal could not be eaten now. Princess Xian looked at Tang Ning and said gratefully, "Thanks to you, you saved me and the prince again." "It's just a little help." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "You are too polite, princess. It's just a little help for you, but it's a life-saving grace for us." Princess Xian looked at Prince Xian and said, "Your Highness must thank him very much." Prince Xian nodded, looked at him, and took the initiative to say, "This prince has always been clear about gratitude and resentment. You saved the princess and saved me twice. You can make a request to this prince." This sentence came from the mouth of the regent of Chu state, and it was very heavy. He didn't even say what the request was, and there were no restrictions, which made it even more heavy. However, thinking carefully, he didn't seem to lack anything, but if he refused directly, it seemed a bit disrespectful to Prince Xian. Tang Ning looked at Li Tianlan, wanting to ask for her opinion. Seeing him looking at his daughter, Prince Xian's face darkened and he said, "This opportunity only comes once, you should think it over carefully and don't waste it." Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "I can't think of it now, I'll tell you when I think of it later." Prince Xian's promise was really insincere. Whether it was a reward of silver or things, it would be fine if he thought these things were too vulgar. Didn't he still have a daughter? As long as he rejected the marriage proposals from Chen State and Kaowen, Tang Ning's mission in Chu State this time would be half completed. If he could abolish the prince and let Zhao Yingying not get married, wouldn't it be the best of both worlds and everyone would be happy? Prince Xian nodded, looked at Li Tianlan, and said, "Lanlan, take Lord Tang around the palace." Li Tianlan looked at Tang Ning and said, "Let's go." "There's nothing good to see in the palace." When they walked into the yard, Li Tianlan looked at him and said, "You didn't eat a bite just now, I'll take you out to eat." "Okay," Tang Ning said, "you treated me to the noodles yesterday, today it's my turn to treat you, next time you treat." Li Tianlan asked, "What do you want to eat?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "Let's eat yesterday's noodles." Tang Ning is from the north, and there has always been a custom in the north of dumplings when going out and noodles when going home. Dumplings are shaped like ingots, which means making a lot of money when going out, and noodles when going home means staying forever. The long noodles are like ropes that tie people back home. He was not very familiar with the customs of the Chu state, but yesterday's noodles were really delicious. The shop was very small. During the day, a tent would be set up on the street outside the shop, and tables and chairs would be placed. When the two walked over, the outside was already full of guests. Tang Ning walked forward and said, "Old lady, 2 bowls of noodles." "You're here." The old lady smiled and looked at them, saying, "Cook inside." "There's no one inside." "The noodles will be here soon." Click. Tang Ning and Li Tianlan walked in. Someone's chopsticks fell to the ground at the stall outside. "Isn't that the princess?" Who is the person next to the princess? Why have I never seen him before? I don't know which family's descendant he is, how come he is with the princess? Princess Changning is well known in Kyoto, and they also know that the princess has never treated the high-ranking children in Kyoto with pretentious words, and they have never seen a man around her. For a moment, everyone in the stall forgot to eat. The princess had a private meeting with the mysterious man. This was rare news, much rarer than the assassination of the prince. However, after taking a sip of soup, the identity of the mysterious man was revealed. Several versions have appeared. The old woman selling noodles knocked on the table with her rolling pin and said angrily, "If you eat your noodles, get out of here if you dare to gossip." Letter to the palace. Princess Xian looked at King Xian and said, "My lord, why are you so stingy this time? That young man has saved you many times, you should thank him." "Thank you very much," King Xian snorted coldly and said, "he has stolen my most precious thing. I wish I could kill him. How can I thank him?" "Ah," Princess Xian said in surprise, "what did he steal from the prince?" King Xian said angrily, "What he stole was Lanlan's heart." "What?" Princess Xian looked at him, confused. "Your Majesty, are you saying that Lanlan likes him? Don't you still know about our daughter?" King Xian looked at her and asked, "Have you ever seen her do this to other men? After she came back from Chen Kingdom, she was often absent-minded. She didn't get better until these 2 days. A little bit. But..." Princess Xian thought for a while, and suddenly a look of surprise appeared on her face, and she said, "Today or later, when I meet this beloved man, no wonder she donated 1,000 taels of silver to Puju Temple inexplicably." King Xian frowned and asked, "What is this, my beloved?" Princess Xian did not answer, but looked at him and said, "I think this young man looks very talented and is a good match for Lanlan. Since Lanlan likes her, why not let them?" "No," King Xian waved his hand and said, "absolutely not." "Why is this?" Princess Xian said in surprise, "My lord, didn't you say that he is the top 3 scholar of the Chen Kingdom? He is extremely talented and compliments Lanlan. It's rare that Lanlan also likes him. What's more, although he is from the Chen Kingdom, but the current situation will be better if Lanlan follows him back to Chen country, why can't they be together?" "You don't know something?" King Xian looked at her and said, "He already has a wife, why can't he make Lanlan his concubine?" Princess Xian was stunned, then shook her head and said, "That would be a pity." She seemed to have remembered something, and suddenly looked up at King Xian and asked, "The prince just said that he stole the prince's most precious thing." King Xian was startled and asked, "Did I say that?" Princess Xian looked at him and said sadly, "It turns out that Lanlan is the most precious thing to the prince, so what is my concubine?" Prince Xian held her in his arms and said, "Lanlan will have her precious county horse in the future. My most precious child will naturally be the princess." After half an hour, King Xian came out of the room. When he stepped out of the door, the smile on his face gradually disappeared, replaced by indifference. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 376. A young boy quickly walked in from outside the courtyard, walked up to King Xian, knelt down on one knee, and spoke in a deep voice. "Your Majesty, Chef Zhao's family." King Xian waved his hand and said, "Look for it now, I'm afraid it's too late." The young general paused, nodded, and said, "Your Majesty is wise, the Zhao family has long been empty." According to the Zhao family's neighbors, they had moved out of Kyoto 5 days ago and are missing. There is no need to waste time looking for them. King Xian looked ahead and said, "They will never appear in Kyoto in their lifetime." The young general lowered his head, thought for a while, and said, "Your Majesty, all the adults in the court." "What's going on?" King Xian looked down at him and asked, You all think the prince should be abolished and replaced by me. The young general did not answer directly, but said in a deep voice, Your Majesty's health is getting worse day by day, and the crown prince is pressing on you step by step. Even if the prince does not make plans for himself, he must make plans for the princess and the princess. King Xian shook his head and said, What's the point of being an emperor? You can't fish even if you are an emperor. Your Majesty. King Xian looked at him and said, Go down. The young general looked up, stood up after a long time, turned around and walked outside. When he walked to the door, a voice came from behind him. I'll give you a few more orders by the way. Prince's mansion. The prince looked gloomy and asked, Did they really say that? The person behind him opened his mouth and said after a long time, Your Highness, you are all a bunch of unruly people. I have given strict orders to the government. If anyone dares to speak rudely to your Highness, they will be put in prison and served with sticks. The assassination of the prince was originally a good plot, and it was easy to point the finger at King Xian. King Xian had a high reputation among the people because of his fairness and selflessness. But if King Xian bribed the assassin in order to win the throne assassinating the prince, what kind of reputation can there be? According to their original plan, when the popular trend began to turn against the prince, they would arrange for Chen's envoy to do something. The marriage between Chen and Chu would be beneficial to the prince, and the one who least wanted to see this happen was naturally King Xian. When the time comes, King Xian will be the mastermind behind destroying the marriage between Chen and Chu, and will deal a heavy blow to him. If these two things develop according to their expectations, even if the trend among the people and the court will not be completely reversed, King Xian will still be at a disadvantage. But who would have thought that something went wrong in this first step? The prince was assassinated, and the people did not condemn King Xian, but looked forward to the prince's death. This unexpected situation completely disrupted their plans. Damn it, the prince swore angrily and kicked over the low table in front of him. Then he hugged his feet with a blue face and cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The person next to me was shocked, Your Highness, are you okay? The prince waved his hand and gritted his teeth and said, Get out of here, everyone. At this time, a figure hurriedly ran in from outside the door. When he stepped across the threshold, he accidentally fell and quickly stood up and said loudly, Your Highness, something big has happened. The prince raised his head and said sternly, What's the matter again? The man raised his head and said loudly, Your Highness, King Xian has been poisoned. When the prince heard this, he looked at him suddenly and asked, What did you say? The man hurriedly stepped forward and said, Your Highness, someone poisoned the food in Prince Xian's mansion. Now people from Prince Xian's mansion are searching for the murderer all over the capital. The prince looked expectant and asked, Has King Xian been poisoned to death? The man shook his head and said, No. The prince's expression was a little disappointed, but overall, he was quite excited. After all, this was one of the few good news he had heard in these days. A smile appeared on his face and he said, I don't know who did it, but it's a pity that he didn't poison him. The man paused and then said, Your Highness, there is one more thing. The prince looked at him and asked, What's the matter? The man said, King Xian just issued a few orders to arrest and imprison several important officials in the court. I don't know what he wants to do. The prince frowned and said, What's going on? The charges he gave were that the Minister of Household Affairs embezzled money from the National Treasury, the Left Minister of the Ministry of War resold arms, and the Right Minister of the Ministry of Personnel used public affairs for personal gain. The man looked at the prince and said, King Xian inexplicably put more than 10 important officials in the court in jail this time. The incident happened suddenly, and your highness had to guard against it? The Minister of Household Affairs, the Left Minister of the Ministry of War, the Right Minister of the Ministry of Personnel. The prince glanced at him and said, These are not our people, why are you panicking? A counselor behind the prince finally couldn't help it, stepped forward and reminded, "Your Highness, except for those who believe in the king, all the people in the court are our people. Although these adults have not taken refuge in the prince, as long as they do not to lean towards King Xian is to support the crown prince's ascension to the throne." When the prince heard this, he couldn't help but trembled and said in horror, "What does King Xian want to do? Does he want to rebel?" The counselor immediately said, "Your Highness, there is no need to panic. Only your Majesty can mobilize the imperial army, and the patrol department is also under the control of the Ministry of War. It is impossible for King Xian to rebel." The prince was shocked and said, "Then what does he want to do?" The counselor said, "I'm afraid he wants to use this to suppress dissidents, so your Highness should be careful." The prince immediately asked, "Then what should I do?" The counselor thought for a while and said, "Your Highness, your Majesty will come to court in person tomorrow morning. King Xian is suspected of assassinating the prince, and he uses the power of the regent to suppress dissidents. The prince only needs to arrange a few highly respected veterans to come to the court tomorrow. Impeach King Xian in the main hall. I believe your Majesty will make a clear decision." "Yes, yes." The prince nodded repeatedly and said, "Prepare the car, I will go to visit the master and the master now." Since a few years ago, due to the illness of Emperor Chu, he spent most of his time in the palace and appeared less and less in the court. All political affairs were left to the regent, so that the people of Kyoto could only we knew there was a regent, but we didn't know there was an emperor. Even the officials in the capital could only see the emperor once a month, when the emperor of Chu came to court in person. The emperor's health was deteriorating, and his visit to court would not last more than a quarter of an hour. Officials in the DPRK and the central government received notice a few days ago that His Majesty will attend the DPRK on June 13. At that time, officials of the 5th rank and above in Kyoto will all attend the DPRK. The pale-faced Emperor Chu was sitting on the dragon chair supported by two eunuchs. An official stepped forward and said, "My lords, what do you want to report?" An old man came forward with a whiteboard in his arms and said, "Your Majesty, His Royal Highness the Crown Prince was assassinated on the streets of Kyoto the day before yesterday. The murderer has not been caught yet. I don't know who the villain is. He is so bold that he dares to do this to the Crown Prince with the intention of disrupting our country of Chu. I sincerely request your Majesty to order the Ministry of Punishment to investigate strictly and never tolerate it." It was rare for Master Taifu to speak in court, which naturally attracted the attention of many people. Although he did not mention King Xian in this paragraph, everyone could tell who Taifu was referring to. Emperor Chu raised his hand with difficulty and said, "Show the prince a seat. The assassination of the prince will be strictly investigated by the Ministry of Punishment and Dali Temple, and there must be no mistakes." After saying these words, he seemed to have spent a lot of effort, leaning on the dragon chair and panting slightly. Another old man stood up and said with cupped hands, "Your Majesty, I impeached King Xian. In the name of Regent, without verification, he imprisoned more than 10 important officials in the court on trumped-up charges. In order to attack dissidents, he acted recklessly. Both the Taifu and the Grand Master were 2 generations of imperial teachers. They also taught the prince how to read. They were the most staunch supporters of the royal family. They were highly respected, deeply trusted by the courtiers and loved by the people." The prince stood at the front of the team, with his head lowered and a smile on his lips. An abnormal blush appeared on Emperor Chu's face and he asked, "Where is King Xian?" A eunuch came forward and said, "His Royal Highness King Xian is ill and will not go to court today." Emperor Chu waved his hand and said, "The regent is impartial, and will not target anything without aim. Let this matter be handed over to the Yashitai for verification. Is there anything else you want to report?" "I have this memorial." The Minister of Rights took a step forward and handed over a memorial, saying, "I impeach the prince for his bad conduct, for being a slave to the common people, for his misdeeds, and for his perverse behavior. The Minister of Rights, holding a memorial in his hand, listed the prince's 23 crimes in detail. He knelt on the ground and shouted like a bell, "I sincerely request your majesty to depose the Prince Liji, so as to rectify the country's foundation and improve the country. I second the proposal. I second the proposal. I second the proposal." All the 6 ministers, except for the imprisoned minister of Hubei, came out. Together with Jing Zheyin, the censor, the minister of Dali Temple, the secretary and supervisor, dozens of officials knelt together neatly, and their voices resounded throughout the hall. The smile on the corner of the prince's mouth had long been frozen on his face, his eyes looked frightened, and his whole body was shaking as if he had fallen into an ice cave. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiaorong. Chapter 377. More than half of the ministers in the court jointly requested that the prince be deposed. In an instant, the court fell silent. You. The prince turned his head, looked at the ministers kneeling on the ground, and said in horror, "Do you want to rebel? What are you doing? Presumptuous." The Grand Master and the Grand Tutor trembled and pointed at the crowd and said angrily, "You are committing the following offense and are being treasonous." Cough. On the dragon chair, Emperor Chu's face turned red, he covered his chest and coughed violently. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." A eunuch immediately stepped forward and said in a panic, "Imperial physician, please call the imperial physician quickly." He glanced down, waved and said, "Your Majesty is ill, retreat from the court, retreat from the court." The 2 eunuchs helped Emperor Chu leave. The Grand Master and the Grand Tutor snorted coldly, waved their sleeves and left. The ministers who were kneeling on the ground slowly stood up. The Minister of the Ministry of Punishment looked at the Minister of the Ministry of Rights next to him and asked, "Master Zhang, you made your own decision, aren't you afraid that the prince will blame you?" The Minister of Rights looked at him and asked, "Someone has been poisoning the food in the palace for half a month. Does Mr. Zhao know what poison they used?" The Ministry of Punishment was responsible for investigating this case. The Minister of Punishment naturally knew the specific details and said, "Zinnia, it is said that this poison has no cure. After 1 month of poisoning, it will be difficult for gods to save it." The Minister of Rights said, "Your Majesty has collapsed. If even the prince collapses, the next one to collapse will be the court and the Chu state. The prince has been bullied to the head. How can the prince be indifferent? I believe that the prince's order yesterday will definitely it's meaningful." Today's morning session lasted only a short time, but 2 major events happened one after another. The Grand Master and the Grand Tutor, who had been ignoring court affairs for a long time, rarely spoke in the court hall, pointing the finger at King Xian, saying that King Xian was arbitrary in order to attack dissidents and disrupt the imperial court. Another thing is even more shocking. Led by the Minister of Rights, nearly half of the important ministers in the court jointly petitioned His Majesty to depose the prince. Although no results were achieved, the impact of this matter was enough to make the entire Kyoto boil. Everyone knows that the prince is immoral, and half of the success of Chu state is due to the regent. However, the prince is a prince after all. According to the ancestral etiquette, only he can become the next emperor of Chu state. But both among the people and the court, there are countless knowledgeable people who are completely disappointed with the prince. They hope that King Xian can lead the Chu country to become more prosperous and powerful, instead of letting the unscrupulous and incompetent prince ruin this finally stable country. What happened in the court today spread out, and such noises continued for a long time. At noon, an imperial decree came from the palace. The prince had lost his virtue and was ordered to reflect and repent in the palace. He should not leave the palace for half a month. In the future, he should know how to be close to virtuous ministers and stay away from villains. At the same time, he was ordered to teach in the East Palace. The East Palace was in panic at the moment. After the early morning court, the prince fell ill in bed with a high fever. Several doctors from the palace came, and they were very worried. This is a gorgeous dividing line. A reminder for novel netizens, please pay attention to resting your eyes when reading for a long time. Recommended reading. This is a gorgeous dividing line. Don't waste me, don't waste me. I am the crown prince, I am the emperor. You treacherous ministers and traitors, you treacherous ministers and traitors. The prince was lying on the bed, his face was pale, his eyes were wide open, and he was still mumbling to himself. The Taifa walked in from outside the door, grabbed an imperial doctor, and asked, "How is the prince?" "It's not optimistic," the imperial doctor said with a serious face. "The prince is mentally traumatized. If he can't get through it, I'm afraid." He didn't finish his sentence, but everyone heard the deeper meaning of his words. At the court this morning, more than half of the important ministers jointly petitioned Your Majesty to depose the prince. The prince was in the palace at that time. How could we not be surprised? As the crown prince of a country, His Majesty's only prince, it is unprecedented for him to be so estranged from his moral character. The Taifa let go of the doctor and said, "Everyone, get out." The doctor and the servants in the room immediately left. The prince's eyes were blank, and he said tremblingly, "Taifu, they are going to abolish me, they are going to abolish me." The Taifa walked to the prince's bed and said slowly, "Your Highness, don't worry. The ancestral etiquette cannot be ignored. As long as Your Highness changes his ways, ascends the throne in the future, and has a group of virtuous ministers around him, he can still become a wise king." The prince trembled and said, "But he won't let me be the emperor. He wants to be the emperor himself. The courtiers have been bribed by him, and the people have been bribed by him. I can't fight him. I can't fight him. Those ministers," he said, "arrest them, just arrest him or scrap him. He is warning me, he is warning me." The Taifa looked at him and said slowly, "He is not warning His Highness." He narrowed his eyes slightly, looked at the prince, and said, "Your Highness must listen carefully to what I will say next. Master Taifu." Seeing the Taifa walking out of the prince's room, everyone saluted. When they saw the prince walking out behind the Taifu, everyone was startled at first, and then immediately said, "See Your Highness." The prince waved his hand and said, "Send off to the master for me." The Taifa looked back at him and said, "Your Highness, take a good rest. I have returned home." The doctor looked at the prince with a puzzled look. A quarter of an hour ago, the prince was still in a trance and couldn't extricate himself. The doctors were helpless. They didn't know what medicine the tutor had just given the prince. How could he get better so quickly? After the tutor left, the prince looked at the person behind him and said, "Send someone to those grassland barbarians and tell them." Prince Xian's mansion. A young general bowed and said, "Your Highness, today's morning court, led by Lord Zhang, dozens of important officials jointly begged His Majesty to depose the prince. /U0026NB. This is a gorgeous dividing line. Novel netizens, please note, please pay attention to rest your eyes when reading for a long time. Recommended reading. This is a gorgeous dividing line. SP, got it. Prince Xian took a sip of tea, his face expressionless, stood up and said, "Send someone to tell them not to do these unnecessary things anymore." Yes, the young general nodded, and then said, "The princess is waiting for you to eat." Prince Xian walked into the dining hall, sat down, looked at Princess Xian, and asked, "What's wrong, you look so sad?" Princess Xian looked at the table full of dishes and said worriedly, "Will someone poison this dish?" Prince Xian shook his head and said, "Don't worry, the chefs have tasted every dish themselves, There's nothing wrong with it? Princess Xian shook her head and said, but what if it's like the kind of lily of the valley that won't cause poisoning immediately, or if it's poisoned later, even if you taste it, it won't take effect immediately, then what can we do? Prince Xian thought for a moment, looked to his side, and said, Lanlan, go and invite Tang Ning, and say that yesterday's banquet was a disrespect for the palace, and we'll make up for it today. Li Tianlan stood up and said, okay. Watching her walk out neatly, Prince Xian shook his head and sighed. Jingxiu Palace. 10 beggar gang disciples holding sticks at their eyebrows easily disintegrated the formation formed by 30 guards, and there was a burst of cheers from all around. Lu Tang stood at the front and said, this formation is really amazing. It can defeat the strong with the weak and the many with the few. If it is used in the military formation, wouldn't it be a strange force that can defeat the strong with the weak? A young general beside him said, Lord Tang is amazing. Even the guards around him are so amazing. Along the way, the accompanying guards have been convinced by the young envoy who sent the marriage. They know that he is not as weak as he looks. He is proficient in both civil and military strategies. If it weren't for him, they don't know how many people would have been lost along the way. A guard came over and said, Commander Lu, there is a woman outside looking for Lord Tang. The young general said, I will report to Lord Tang. Tang Ning was playing Go with Zhao Man in the room, but received a post from the Ministry of Rites. The content of the post was very simple. The wedding banquet that was supposed to be held tonight was temporarily cancelled due to some force majeure. The Ministry of Rites hereby expresses its deep apologies to the Chen state envoys. It doesn't take much thought to know that the voices of the Chu court deposing the prince are rampant. It's not certain whether this marriage can be completed, so why bother to welcome the bride and hold a banquet? Zhao Man was stunned when she heard this and asked, if the Chu prince is deposed, do I not have to get married? Tang Ning nodded and said, if the Chu prince is deposed, we can prepare to set off and return. Great. Zhao Man's eyes suddenly burst into brilliance, and she almost threw herself on Tang Ning, hugged him, and said happily, I don't have to get married. Sir Tang, there is a woman outside. The young general named Chen Zhou walked in from the outside of the door, his footsteps suddenly stagnated, and the next moment, he stretched out his hand forward, groping, and said, Sir Tang, my eyes suddenly became blind just now. You have superb medical skills. Can you help me take a look? Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 378. The young general fumbled around and walked out of the door before saying, my eyes seem to be fine again, please don't bother me, sir. Oh, by the way, Sir Tang, there is a girl outside looking for you, she said her surname is Li. Tang Ning only knew one girl with the surname Li. He looked at Zhao Man and said, Princess, wait here for a while, I'll go out for a while. Zhao Man stood there, frowned, girl with the surname Li. In Jingxiu Palace, Tang Ning walked to a side hall, looked at Li Tianlan, and asked in surprise, why are you here? Li Tianlan said, my father said that yesterday's banquet doesn't count, and it will be made up today, so he asked me to invite you over. But I've already eaten. Tang Ning shook his head and said, I'd better not go. Li Tianlan glanced at him, stood up and said, it's up to you. Tang Ning felt a little uneasy when she looked at him, and always felt that she was possessed by a demon. Wait, Tang Ning stopped her and said, maybe your father has something important to say. I'd better go back with you. Zhao Man ran in from outside and asked, where are you going? Tang Ning explained, I'm going to Prince Xian's mansion and will be back soon. Zhao Man looked at him and said, I want to go with you. Tang Ning walked to her side and whispered, I'll be back soon. You wait here obediently. Zhao Man looked at Li Tianlan, then looked at Tang Ning and said, then I'll wait for you. Come back early. Walking out of Jingxiu Palace, Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, Is that Princess Pingyang just now? Tang Ning nodded. Li Tianlan looked ahead and said, this princess is very beautiful. Tang Ning said, you two are the same. She is still young. Aren't you also in your prime? She is a princess and has a noble status. If you want, you can also become a princess. The first meeting between the princess and the princess was also quite harmonious. With her outstanding desire to survive, Tang Ning arrived at Prince Xian's mansion safely. In the hall, Princess Xian looked at him with a smile and said, little Tang is here, please sit down. Tang Ning bowed and said, greetings, Your Majesty, Princess. You're welcome. Princess Xian smiled and said, just treat this place as your own home. The banquet at Prince Xian's mansion was not very particular. There was a table with 4 seats, just like a family meal. Tang Ning sat opposite Prince Xian, with Li Tianlan on the left and Princess Xian on the right. The second time they met, Princess Xian's attitude towards him was much warmer than yesterday, while Prince Xian still had a cold face, which always reminded Tang Ning of the rich man Tang. Prince Xian looked at him and said, eat. Tang Ning picked up a piece of cucumber and put it in his mouth, frowning slightly. Prince Xian paused with his chopsticks, and the cucumber he had picked up fell on the table again. He asked, why, is it poisonous? It's too sour. Tang Ning shook his head and said, who made this dish? They put too much vinegar. Prince Xian glanced at him and said, just eat it. Tang Ning glanced at him. What kind of attitude is this? Is this how you treat others to a meal? He didn't owe him money or favors. He should have held a banquet to repay his kindness, but he didn't expect that he was asked to test the poison. In fact, he didn't need to be so careful. The most commonly used arsenic can be tested with a silver needle. Other doses are too small to be useful. Large doses will definitely affect the taste. There are not many chronic and almost undetectable poisons like Lily of the Valley. If it weren't for the princess, he wouldn't bother to come to Prince Xian's mansion. Seeing Tang Ning tasted all the dishes, Prince Xian looked at Princess Xian and said, now you can finally feel relieved. You'll get wrinkles if you keep worrying. Princess Xian looked at him and frowned, do you think I'm too old? Prince Xian looked at her and whispered, there are outsiders here. What kind of outsider is Xiao Tang? Princess Xian looked at Tang Ning and said, will outsiders save us twice? Tang Ning took a bite of the dish and said, I have a few recipes here. They can be used on the face to eliminate wrinkles. If the princess likes them, I'll write them down and bring them to you next time. Princess Xian looked at him and said in surprise, there are such recipes. Tang Ning nodded and said, they are all secret recipes that are not passed on. In the capital of Chen State, you have to pay a high price to buy finished medicines. These recipes were picked out by Tang Ning from the prescriptions of the Imperial Hospital. After being improved by himself, they are pure and pollution-free. They were originally used to please his mother-in-law. The princess no longer regards him as an outsider, so it's okay to give them away as a favor. Women will never refuse beauty. The noble ladies of Chen State have been conquered. They can also consider opening a few branches in Chu State and spread their reputation here with the princess first. I'm so sorry. Princess Xian looked at him and smiled, no need to wait for the next time. Let Lanlan take you to her study and write a few prescriptions. It won't delay anything. Tang Ning still underestimated the pursuit of beauty by middle-aged women. He nodded and said, okay. Li Tianlan's study is in her courtyard, which is where Tang Ning jumped over the wall last time. He walked into the study and saw several neat rows of bookshelves, all of which were books. Xiao Ai was called a talented woman because she could write poems and lyrics, and she could also write beautiful articles, but in terms of the breadth of knowledge, she was actually not comparable to Li Tianlan. The top 3 scholars in Chu State were not admitted by reading a few books. He even found a bookshelf, which was full of books such as Romance of the West Chamber, Peony Pavilion and Peach Blossom Fan, all in various versions. These were all genuine books from Tang Grenzai, and no one knew how she bought them. Tang Ning wrote down the recipe and said, although you need to be careful about the diet, you don't need to be too careful. Just have someone keep a close eye on you. Which of these royal nobles doesn't have some experience in guarding against assassins? If Prince Xian didn't even have these few trusted people, he wouldn't have the status he has today. Li Tianlan said, Father just wants to reassure mother. Tang Ning looked at her, thought for a while, and asked, what does Prince Xian think? I don't know. Li Tianlan shook his head and said, I only know that father doesn't actually want to sit in that position. Tang Ning didn't know whether Prince Xian had any intention of getting involved in the throne, but he definitely didn't look like a person who would wait for death. The situation in Kyoto and the mission of the Chen state delegation on this trip were all in his mind. The court of Chu was already turbulent. Although it was suppressed by the king of Chu, the undercurrent was still there. It was possible that the country would be overthrown and the country would change hands. He returned from Prince Xian's mansion, and soon Hirui knocked on the door and came in. Sir, the Honglu Temple sent another invitation today. He put an invitation on the table and said, although the wedding banquet prepared by the Ministry of Rites has been postponed, the King of Chu ordered the Honglu Temple to entertain us and the grassland envoys. The banquet will be held in 2 days. The Honglu Temple and the Ministry of Rites have some of the same functions, but they are independent. However, no matter what, the invitations from these two departments are of official nature of the court. Hirui looked at him, thought for a moment, and then said, Sir, it is right for them to invite us to a banquet, but what exactly does it mean to invite the grassland people at the same time? Tang Ning asked, what has happened in the grassland these 2 days? Another envoy has come, and he seems to be of high status. Hirui looked at him and said solemnly, the grassland people have raised the conditions for marrying Princess Changning to sending 3,000 war horses from the Chu state every year, and non-aggression within 10 years. 3,000 war horses every year, this is also a number that cannot be ignored for most of the Wanyan tribe. It is hard to imagine that they would be willing to pay such a price just to marry a woman. This will not bring them any substantial benefits. The only benefit is that it will damage the relationship between Chen and Chu, or what subsequent plans they have. Then prepare to attend the banquet. Tang Ning couldn't think of anything more far-reaching for the time being. Looking at Hirui, he said, whatever they are thinking, they will soon reveal their foxtails. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 379. Since the Emperor of Chu took office, the state of Chu has worked hard to govern and stabilize the country. In the past 10 years, its national power has increased rapidly, and it has gradually caught up with the state of Chen. In the past few years, although there have been repeated interferences from the grassland people on the border, and according to custom, tribute has to be paid to Chen state every year, the country has been relatively stable, and the people can live and work in peace and contentment. However, since the beginning of this year, a series of events have gradually broken this stability. The rise of large tribes on the grassland doubled the pressure on the border, and the alliance with Chengguo alleviated this pressure. However, before everyone could breathe a sigh of relief, the prince's condition worsened rapidly, and he was getting worse day by day. Foolishness and a gloomy future for the country have aroused the desire of countless knowledgeable people to protect the country. By mid-June of the year, envoys from the state of Chen and the state of Chu came to the capital one after another. The prince was assassinated, and King Xian was assassinated. There was an undercurrent in the capital, and even ordinary people noticed a trace of abnormal atmosphere. Officials in the DPRK and China, as well as people who are always paying attention to political affairs, are even more worried. The current situation has reached an extreme level. A small spark may completely ignite it. When the time comes, no one can predict what will be the final result. Kyoto, in. Although the envoys from the grassland and the envoys from the Chen state were both guests from afar, in terms of their relationship with the Chu state, the grassland was naturally far inferior to the Chen state, and the place they lived in was nothing more than a post station. In a certain room in the inn, many grassland messengers stood in front of a young man, looking extremely respectful. The young man is dressed in Han Chinese clothes, holds a folding fan, and has his hair pulled up into a high bun. He has a handsome appearance and can be regarded as a handsome young man. Wang Yanyan pushed the door open and said happily, "Second brother, why are you here?" The young man looked at her, smiled and said, "Yan'er, you ran out quietly this time, are you ready to accept your father's punishment?" "The worst thing is that I will be punished." Wang Yanyan curled her lips and said nonchalantly, "I came out this time and saw a lot of things and met a lot of people. Even if I am punished, I am willing to do so." The young man patted her on the head and said with a smile, "It seems that your trip was not in vain. Your Chinese is getting better and better." The middle-aged woman walked in from the door, cupped her hands and said, "I have met the second prince." The young man looked at her and said, "Master Gongsun, there is no need to be polite." After everyone entered the room, he asked, "How is the plan going?" The middle-aged woman said, "The plan to assassinate Princess Chen failed, but we have gained the trust of the Crown Prince of Chu, and the plan to marry Princess Changning is in progress. Honglu Temple will host a banquet for us and Chen in 2 days. Ambassador, that's a great opportunity. I heard that the courtiers of Chu state suggested that the prince be deposed." The young man shook his head and said, "I thought we could achieve our goal with the help of the prince's power, but I didn't expect that the prince would not be able to protect himself." The middle-aged woman looked up at him and said, "The prince just sent someone to deliver the message. The matter may be better than what the second prince heard." "Oh," the young man raised his eyebrows slightly and said, "I have just come here, and I have to trouble Master Gongsun to tell me about the affairs of Chu state." Splendid palace. Zhao Man's mood was much better than when she first came to Chu state. Every day she looked forward to deposing the prince. After deposing the prince, she could go back the same way and live back in her princess mansion outside the palace. There would be no restrictions and she could do whatever she wanted. Chen Zhou walked in from outside the door, bowed and said, "Master Tang, someone from Prince Xian's mansion said that Prince Xian asked you to come over." Chen Zhou was a smart and skilled young man, so Tang Ning specially recruited him from Lutang. Zhao Man held her chin up with her hands, pouted, and asked, "Why did you go to Xinwangfu again?" Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Whether we can go back depends on King Xian. Only by visiting Prince Xian's residence more can we prepare in advance." Zhao Man wondered, "What does it have to do with King Xian whether we can go back?" Tang Ning looked at her and said, "Think about it, if King Xian can become the emperor, wouldn't the prince be deposed? In this case, the marriage will be invalidated, and we can naturally go back." Zhao Man's eyes lit up and she said, "Then you go quickly, leave early and come back early." Before coming to the prince's palace, Tang Ning thought that the old man Xian Wang wanted him to try poison again. After arriving at the prince's palace, she realized that it was not for dinner. Li Tianlan waited for him in front of the mansion and said, "Father is waiting for you in the study." Tang Ning followed her in and asked, "What does he want from me?" Li Tianlan shook his head and said, "My father didn't tell me, and I don't know either." Li Tianlan walked to the study door and knocked on the door. "Come in," a deep voice came from the study. Li Tianlan opened the door and walked in. Tang Ning followed her into the study room and saw King Xian standing in front of the table, writing something without looking back. He walked to the table and saw a piece of white paper spread on the table with 2 words on it. Although there are only 2 words, it is majestic and majestic. There is madness in the atmosphere, and beauty in the madness. King Xian put down his pen and asked, "What do you think of this madly scrawled painting by me?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "Okay." He really didn't understand the art of calligraphy. If King Xian hadn't said that what he wrote was wild cursive, he would have thought that the other party was doing some kind of performance art like ink graffiti. King Xian glanced at him and said, "I didn't expect you to know cursive calligraphy, so why don't you tell me what's so good about this cursive calligraphy? This is a bit too much to ask. Giving face to others is giving face to yourself." Tang Ning had no idea what was good about his cursive writing. Looking at the two words on the table, he thought for a moment and said, "Fortunately, it's cursive enough." Cough, Li Tianlan couldn't help coughing. Prince Xian frowned and asked, "You are so perfunctory to me, but you think my handwriting is unbearable?" Tang Ning shook his head and said, "Not really, it's just that I don't understand cursive writing, so I can't make any judgment on your handwriting." Prince Xian shook his head and said, "You passed the imperial examination, but you don't know calligraphy. Well, I'll give you this calligraphy." Tang Ning looked at it carefully and said, "Your Majesty, these two words are probably not suitable." "Not suitable?" Prince Xian frowned and asked, "A real man should stand tall and upright. In this life, you should live up to the word open and frank. Do you think these two words are not suitable for you?" Tang Ning identified it again and suddenly said, "It turns out to be frank." Prince Xian frowned and asked, "What did you think it was?" "I thought it was something else." Tang Ning shook his head. "He could write frankly and dang few. Almost the same." Prince Xian's cursive writing was really frank. He looked at Prince Xian and changed the subject. "Why did Prince Xian ask me to come here?" Prince Xian looked at him and said slowly, "You have saved me time and again, and saved the princess. If I don't show some appreciation, others will think that I am an ungrateful person." Tang Ning waved his hand and said, "It's just a small favor, not worth mentioning." Prince Xian looked at him and said, "Giving you gold and silver is a bit too vulgar. You are a Chen countryman, and I can't reward you with an official position." "I thought about it. You and Lanlan are of similar age and have known each other for a long time. Why don't you?" "This." Tang Ning was stunned, looked at Prince Xian, then looked at Li Tianlan, and said in disbelief, "Isn't this bad?" Prince Xian looked at him and said slowly, "Why don't you become sworn brothers and sisters?" Tang Ning looked at Prince Xian and was stunned. Prince Xian's turn was too abrupt, so he couldn't react for a while. After talking in circles for a long time, it turned out that he wanted him and Li Tianlan to become sworn brothers and sisters. She was a few months older than him, so even if they were sworn brothers, they should be sisters and brothers. Moreover, he already had several sisters. Why did he want another one? Besides, if he really became sworn brothers with Li Tianlan, what would Prince Xian be to him? Wouldn't he have an extra father for no reason? Tang Ning looked at Prince Xian again, his eyes slightly fixed. He kept saying something about repaying a favor, but he didn't trust him at all. It turned out that he was trying to take advantage of him in a roundabout way. This old man was really bad. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 380. Tang Ning had already discovered King Xian's dislike of him. How could he make him and Li Tianlan become brothers and sisters for no reason? The purpose must be impure. Tang Ning raised her hand and said politely, "The prince loves me so much. The princess has a body of gold. How can Tang Ning be so virtuous and capable? She doesn't dare to call her brother or sister. No matter what status you have, it's just a cloud." King Xian waved his hand and said, "Lanlan was kind to you once, and you saved us again and again. This is all fate. The princess is also very fond of you. Appreciate it. Why don't you marry Jinlan today?" "I disagree. Before Tang Ning could speak, Li Tianlan said something, turned around and walked out of the study. I didn't mean that. Your Majesty, it's better not to mention it again in the future. Tang Ning cupped her hands and followed her out. King Xian clenched his fist, but in the end he just waved it heavily. Tang Ning followed Li Tianlan and said as she walked, your old man is really, inexplicably, sworn brother. Li Tianlan walked in front and asked casually without continuing the topic, when will you return to Chen country? Tang Ning said, wait until the prince is deposed. What if the prince will not be deposed? Then we have to go. Tang Ning thought for a moment, looked at her and asked, do you want to go with us? Li Tianlan said, wherever my father and mother are, I will be there. Tang Ning still believed that the prince would be deposed. King Xian, a bad old man, was so bad. How could the stupid prince of Chu state be able to outplay him? Li Tianlan took 2 steps forward, then looked back at him and asked, why did you reject my father just now? You said we would become brothers and sisters with you. Tang Ning shook her head and said, why do I need so many sisters? He already has cousin Tang Shui and sister Su Maiqian. Xiao Xiao calls him brother, Fang Xiaoya calls him brother Tang Ning, Zhao Man calls him good brother when there is no one around, and Xiaoxiu's title of brother Xiaoning has not changed yet. Coming here would sometimes make him feel full of guilt. Why would he need another sister? At such a sensitive time, it was really strange that King Xian called him over for this matter. He didn't even get a cup of tea in the palace today, so he planned to go back to Jingxia Palace. When I walked to the door, I thought of something. I turned to look at Li Tianlan and said, why don't we go out to eat noodles? It's your turn to treat me today. At a small street shop, Tang Ning walked into the shop and turned around and said, old lady, please have 2 bowls of noodles. The old noodle seller's business has always been very good, and now it's dinner time. There are all the seats outside, but there is only 1 table inside. There were 3 people sitting at the innermost table, with Tang Ning and Li Tianlan sitting on the outside. Second brother, the noodles cooked by this old woman are delicious. You must try them later. Hearing a familiar voice, Tang Ning looked over and saw Wan Yan, dressed as a Han Chinese, talking excitedly to a young man. The dress she was wearing was one that Zhao Man had eliminated, and the beads on her hair were also unwanted by Zhao Man. She and Zhao Man had similar builds, and the clothes fit him perfectly. In addition to Zhao Man and the young man, the middle-aged woman was also there. After the 2 sat down, the people inside naturally discovered them. When the young man glanced at Li Tianlan, he paused for a moment. When Wan Yan saw Tang Ning, she almost jumped up and asked, why are you here? Tang Ning glanced at her and said calmly, this is not owned by your family. Can't I just eat a bowl of noodles? Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, friend? Who is his friend? Wan Yan sat down again, glanced at him, and said, you'd better pray that you don't fall into my hands in the future. Enemies. Tang Ning glanced at her, then looked at Li Tianlan and explained, they are from the grasslands. They tried to break up the marriage on the way, and I caught them once. Wan Yan stood up angrily, patted the table, and said, whoever you caught, I stood up for myself. If it weren't for your conspiracy, in short, you Han people are so crafty. Li Tianlan said, she speaks Chinese very well. As a little barbarian girl from the prairie, Wan Yan's Chinese is indeed very good, but it depends on who taught her. Although she speaks Chinese well, she doesn't understand the etiquette and rules of the Han people at all. Once a teacher, a lifelong father. Even if their master-disciple relationship only lasts for half a day, they are still teachers for half a day. She should treat him be a little more polite, rather than start chattering to the young man in prairie dialect, and look at him with contempt from time to time, which you can guess is not a good thing. Tang Ning looked at her, moved her lips, and said silently, is your butt itchy again? Wan Yan looked at him with confusion and asked, What did you say? Tang Ning turned her head and ignored her. Here comes the noodles. The old woman brought 2 bowls of noodles over. Li Tianlan handed him a pair of chopsticks and asked, what's wrong with her butt? Cough, cough, Tang Ning choked on a mouthful of noodles and covered her mouth, saying, today's noodles have too much pepper. Although she came late, the old woman served them first. Wang Yanyan complained a few times about this, but was helpless. The young man opposite looked at her and asked, is he an envoy of the Chen state? Wang Yanyan gritted her teeth and said, among the envoys of Chen state, he is the worst. The young man held a folding fan and said, such a young envoy is rare. The middle-aged woman beside the 2 looked at Tang Ning, her eyes flickering slightly. After a while, Tang Ning and Li Tianlan finished their noodles, put a piece of silver on the table, and stepped on a small beetle that crawled to his feet, then looked at Li Tianlan and said, let's go. The 2 left the store, and the middle-aged woman looked at the insect corpse on the ground, her face changed slightly. Tang Ning stood on the street and looked back at the store. Li Tianlan turned his head to look at him and asked, what's wrong? Tang Ning looked at her and warned, be careful when you meet that middle-aged woman in the future. Li Tianlan nodded and said, she is good at martial arts. Not only that, she also knows the art of poison and witchcraft. Tang Ning shook her head and said, don't let her get close to you. Tang Ning didn't know how good the middle-aged woman was at martial arts, but he knew that her poison skills were not ordinary, and she seemed to know some witchcraft. In his impression, only Sumei and the omnipotent old beggar knew this kind of evil thing. It is easy to dodge an open spear, but it is difficult to guard against an arrow from the dark. If ordinary people don't know witchcraft, even masters are likely to be hit. Li Tianlan frowned and asked, poison technique. It's hard to explain in 1 or 2 sentences. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, will you go to the banquet at the Honglu temple tomorrow? Li Tianlan nodded and said, my father will go tomorrow, and I will go with him. Tang Ning waved and said, see you tomorrow. The banquet at the Honglu temple was for the envoys of the state of Chen and the envoys of the grassland. As a princess, Zhao Man did not need to attend. And in order to show that the state of Chu attaches great importance to the envoys of the 2 countries, Prince Xian will also be present today. This is the regent of my Chu state, Prince Xian, and this is Princess Changning. The minister of the Honglu temple first introduced Prince Xian and Li Tianlan to everyone, and then looked down and introduced, Princess, this is Mr. Tang, the marriage envoy of Chen state, and this is the second prince of Wanyan tribe. After the introduction, another official bowed and said, all envoys have come from afar, and the Honglu temple is receiving you by the imperial order. Please take a seat. Sitting at the top are Prince Xian and Li Tianlan, and the 2 rows on the left and right are the envoys of Chen state and the grassland envoys respectively. The Chu state respects the left, so the envoys of Chen state are on the left, and Tang Ning and Lu Tang sit in the front. Across from them are the grassland people, led by the young man and Wang Yanyan who I met yesterday. Tang Ning is facing Wang Yanyan, and when he looks up, he sees her staring at him unkindly. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 381. The former assassin suddenly turned into the messenger of the grassland. In just a few days, the prisoners under the command could become equal to them. Things in this world are really amazing. Tang Ning's eyes swept across Wei Nianyan and then focused on what was in front of her. The banquet at Honglu Temple was a formal state banquet, with low tables for 1 person on both sides, and several dancers in the hall, dancing gracefully to the music. Halfway through the banquet, Shaoqing Honglu stood up and left the banquet. He asked with a smile, the envoys from the 2 countries have come all the way. I wonder if they are still used to the dishes of Chu. The customs of Chu are different from those of the 2 countries. If there is any negligence, please forgive me. Hirui looked at Tang Ning, stood up and cupped his hands and said, Chen and Chu have been friends since ancient times, and we have quite a lot of similarities in their meals. We are used to it. Hirui is the prime minister of Honglu Temple and is good at dealing with such situations. He can pull the other party into the same camp with just one sentence. The young man next to Wang Yanyan stood up with a folding fan in his hand and said, I have heard for a long time that the dishes of Chen and Chu are exquisite. When I saw them today, they were indeed extraordinary. There were brave warriors on the grassland, cooking food. It's far inferior to the Han people. These words were overtly complimentary and covertly derogatory, secretly sarcastic that the two countries of Chen and Chu could only cook, and that their prairie people were the real warriors. Honglu Shaoqing looked at him and said, I have long heard that the men on the grassland are good at riding, shooting, and wrestling. Today is a chance. I wonder if the second prince can let us see the bravery of the warriors on the grassland. Tang Ning raised his head and glanced at Honglu Shaoqing. Being able to sit in this position, it was impossible for him not to hear what the second prince had just hinted at. However, not only did he not uphold the dignity of Chu state, but he followed what the second prince said. If he didn't get his position as Shaoqing Honglu through the back door, then he had some bad motives. Honglu Shaoqing walked to the front, bowed his hands to King Xian, and said, Your Majesty, why don't we let them perform, so as to add to the fun of this banquet? King Xian looked calm and said, Everything is fine, you might as well take a look. The young man looked behind him and said, Hulihan, Ahulai, you two come forward and let them see the bravery of my prairie warriors. The dancer in the palace retreated, and two prairie men stepped forward. In terms of body shape alone, these two prairie men were much taller and more powerful than the Han people. The muscles on their exposed arms were bulging, as graceful as wild beasts, which had a great visual impact. This is related to their deep-rooted concepts and beliefs. Prairie people, including Xiaomaniu, all believe that real men should eat meat and drink wine. Real men are those who can tear apart jackals and split tigers and leopards. Chen and Chu, the country's concept, is exactly the opposite. The traditional concepts in their bones make them believe that the grasslands are full of reckless men. Only studying for the imperial examination can reflect the charm of a man. It is to attract women's liking. Two prairie men walked into the hall, bowed down, put their hands on each other's shoulders, shouted loudly, and threw themselves together. The sport they are engaging in at the moment is wrestling, which in layman's terms is wrestling, which is equivalent to a different kind of competition. The one who knocks the opponent to the ground first is the winner. The test is the use of strength and skills. For Tang Ning, wrestling was naturally not as entertaining as martial arts competitions. Such a reckless man with nothing but brute strength could easily win even if there were a few more. But no matter what, the collision of muscles, coupled with the shouts and roars of the two people, was still a bit shocking. Hirui, who was sitting next to Tang Ning, looked at it with eyes wide open and a look of fear on his face. Boom! In the end, the slightly smaller man was thrown to the ground by his opponent, and the winner was determined in this wrestling match. Honglu Shaoqing stepped forward and praised, the warriors on the grassland are indeed brave. The winner of the wrestling match did not go on. Instead, he turned around, looked at Lu Tang, who was wearing light armor, and said a few words. Honglu Shaoqing turned his head, looked at the second prince, and said in surprise, What did this warrior say? The second prince smiled and said, Hulihan wants to compete with this general. I wonder if this general dares to accept the challenge. When Hirui heard this, his eyelids twitched, and he immediately turned around and said, Commander Lu, don't be impulsive. The second prince looked at the man and said, Hulihan, go down. You are so strong. It would be bad if you hurt the general. Lu Tang stood up and said, Lu Tang, please enlighten me. Hirui looked at Tang Ning and said worriedly, Master Tang, Commander Lu will lead him. Tang Ning waved her hand and said, Don't worry, Mr. He. Commander Lu knows what's going on. After all, Lu Teng was also the son of the Minister of War. He was born as a general. He couldn't defeat Tang Shui and Tang Yaoyao. He couldn't even deal with a grassland rough man. Would Emperor Chen trust him to escort the mission? Honglu Shaoqing stepped forward again and looked at King Xian. King Xian waved his hand and said, "Then let them compete." Honglu Shaoqing walked over, looked at the two of them and said, "In this competition, until the point is reached, whoever falls to the ground first will lose." A man named Hulihan stood opposite Lu Teng. After Honglu Shaoqing announced the start, he suddenly rushed towards Lu Teng. He grabbed Lu Teng's shoulders, grinned, and exerted slight force, but the person opposite didn't move at all. There was a trace of surprise on his face, and even with half of his strength, he still couldn't move the person opposite him at all. 70%, 90%, when he used all his strength and his face turned red from holding back, Lu Teng finally moved. He grabbed the man's waist and lifted him up. Lu Teng threw it out, returned to his seat, bowed his hands, and said, "Thank you." Not only the officials of the Chu state, but also the people of the grassland opened their mouths in surprise. After the second prince reacted, he walked forward and said with a smile, "This general is very capable. It is the basic skill of martial artists to keep their lower body as still as a mountain, and it has even become an instinct. In terms of basic skills, Tang Ning may not be as solid as Lu Teng." The man got up from the ground, patted the dust off his body, looked at Lu Teng, and said unconvincedly, "Wrestling, you win, you dare to compete in archery." "Hulihan, get off." The second prince looked at him and said, "Don't make trouble." "No problem." Prince Xian stepped forward and said, "The banquet is almost over, it's good to have a lively time, and I also want to see the archery skills of the grassland warriors." The second prince cupped his hands and said, "Then I will show you my ugly skills." The junior secretary of Honglu stepped forward and said, "The place here is narrow and you can't show your skills. Let's go outside." At this point, if you don't accept the challenge, it means that you are afraid and dare not fight. Tang Ning didn't say much. The grassland people are good at riding and shooting, and many people never leave their bows. Before entering the Honglu temple, their weapons were temporarily stored in the gatehouse. At this moment, they brought 2 bows. The junior minister of rites looked at a servant behind him and said, "Go find a target." "No need to bother." The second prince shook his head, took out an apple from his sleeve, and said, "Why not put this apple on the top of your head? Whoever can shoot the apple from 30 steps away will win." The junior minister of rites showed a hint of hesitation on his face and said, "This is not good. What if someone is shot?" The second prince smiled and said, "If anyone is afraid, just admit defeat." "Hulihan." He put the apple on his head and said, "You shoot first." The big man walked 30 steps away, drew his bow and shot. Whoosh! There was a sound of breaking wind, and the arrow shot through the apple on his head, and the arrowhead sank into the wall. The officials of the Honglu temple couldn't help but take a breath of cold air. If the arrow had gone 2 or 3 inches lower, the second prince of the grassland would have been bloody on the spot. This shows that he was very confident in the man's archery skills. The second prince stroked his messy hair, looked at Tang Ning and Lu Teng, and said with a smile, "It's your turn." An official had already handed over the apple. Tang Ning looked at Hirui, whose face changed. He covered his forehead and immediately said, "Master Tang, I feel unwell." This chapter was first published on AIU Voice Novel Network. Please remember the website address.